The VIP lounge went silent the moment the city's ghost lifted his glass. Juan Freeman, cold, untouchable, the man who owned every shadow in the district, was about to take a sip of his bourbon when the heavy oak doors splintered open. "Help me. Please." Every head snapped toward the entrance. Emma Watson stood there, her hair a tangled mess, her skin slick with sweat and rain, clutching a tattered backpack as if it were a shield. Her eyes were wide, brimming with a raw, primal terror that didn't belong in a room this polished. She stumbled forward, her knees hitting the plush carpet right at Juan's feet. "Don't let him take me," she gasped, her voice cracking as she pointed a shaking finger toward the doorway. Behind her, a man in a crisp blue uniform loomed, his hand resting heavy on his holster. Juan's men reached for their weapons instantly. The air turned electric. No one spoke, but the Mafia boss raised a single hand, freezing the room in place. "Why?" Juan asked, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Why should I care about a girl the law wants?" Emma's lips trembled as she looked back at the officer with the predatory smile. "Because," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the rain. "He isn't the law. He's the one who took the others." A ripple of shock swept through the guards. Juan's jaw tightened. He didn't look at the girl, he looked at the man in the doorway, specifically at the missing badge number and the way his fingers twitched for a kill. And then Emma said something that made even the city's most feared man feel a chill. "He told me I was next on the list he sold to you." In that moment, Juan Freeman realized this wasn't just a kidnapping, it was a betrayal from within his own empire. Before we begin, click subscribe, like this video and tell me in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring more thrilling stories, and trust me, you won't want me to miss them. Now let's get into the story. The VIP lounge existed in a pocket of silence that money couldn't buy and fear couldn't penetrate. Juan Freeman had built it that way, soundproofed walls, a single entrance guarded by men who'd killed for less than a sideways glance, and a guest list that read like a roster of the city's most carefully buried secrets. Tonight, like most nights, it was nearly empty. Just Juan, his ledger, and the comfortable weight of absolute control. He sat in the corner booth, the one with a clear view of the door and no blind spots, his dark suit pressed to perfection despite the late hour. The bourbon in his glass was older than most of his enemies' careers. The numbers in the ledger represented debts that would never be forgiven, favors that would be called in when the city least expected it. This was his sanctuary. His fortress. The one place where even the chief of police waited for an invitation before crossing the threshold. The crystal tumbler had just touched his lips when the world shattered. The oak doors, 1,200 pounds of reinforced wood and steel, burst open so hard they cracked against the interior walls. Juan didn't flinch. His eyes simply lifted from the page, cold and measuring, as a figure stumbled into his sanctuary like a wounded animal fleeing a hunter. She was young, mid-20s maybe, with dark hair plastered to her pale face and a blue shirt torn at the collar. Rain and sweat had turned her jeans black at the knees. She clutched a battered backpack to her chest like a shield, her breath coming in ragged gasps that echoed in the sudden, terrible silence. "Please." The word ripped from her throat. "Help me." Juan's men materialized from the shadows, Victor at the bar, Chin near the pool table, both with hands already inside their jackets. The woman didn't seem to see them. Her wild, terrified eyes locked onto Juan with the desperation of someone who'd run out of options and found herself at the edge of a cliff. She stumbled forward 3 steps before her legs gave out. She didn't quite fall, she sank, collapsing to her knees beside his table with a sound that was half sob, half prayer. "Please don't let him take me." That's when Juan saw him. The silhouette filled the doorway like a bad omen, blue uniform, utility belt, badge catching the amber light from the chandelier. The man's hand rested on his holster with practiced ease, but his smile was wrong. Too confident. Too hungry. "Sir," the officer said, his voice carrying the false authority of someone used to being obeyed. "I need you to step away from the girl. She's under arrest." Juan Freeman set down his glass with deliberate care. He'd ruled this city's underworld for 15 years. He knew every cop on the take, every detective with dirty hands, every uniform that belonged to his payroll. He'd never seen this man before in his life. And that, Juan thought as his eyes moved from the trembling girl to the predator in the doorway, was very interesting indeed. The tension in the room coiled like a spring wound too tight. Victor and Chen hadn't moved, but their stillness was the kind that preceded violence. The girl, Emma, Juan would learn later, pressed closer to his booth, her breathing shallow and panicked. The officer took a step inside. Just one. His boots were wrong, civilian tactical boots, not department issue. Juan noticed. He always noticed. I said step away from her. The man's hand tightened on his holster, but he didn't draw. Interesting. A real cop would have already called for backup. A real cop wouldn't have come alone to Juan Freeman's private lounge. Juan leaned back in his seat, the leather creaking softly. He didn't look at the girl trembling beside him. His gaze stayed locked on the man in blue, cataloging every detail with the cold precision that had kept him alive in a business where mistakes were measured in body bags. Victor, Juan said quietly. What precinct uses silver badges? Victor's response was immediate. None in this city, boss. Silver's county sheriff. And yet our friend here has a city police uniform with a county badge. Juan tilted his head slightly. That's careless. The officer's jaw twitched. His free hand moved to his radio, but the motion was hesitant, performative. Juan watched him fumble for the call button, watched him pretend to key the mic. No static. No dispatcher's voice. The radio wasn't even on. You want to try that again? Juan asked, his voice dropping to a register that made grown men reconsider their life choices. This time, maybe turn it on first. The girl let out a sound that might have been a laugh or a sob. The officer's face darkened. I don't need to explain procedure to a criminal, he snapped, but the confidence was cracking now, exposing something desperate underneath. She's wanted for questioning in a... What's your badge number? Juan interrupted. Silence. Your name? The officer's hand moved from his holster to his hip, a tell that screamed amateur. Chin shifted his weight, and suddenly there were two guns pointed at the doorway from angles the officer couldn't cover. I'm trying to be professional here, the man said, but his voice had climbed an octave. You're interfering with police business. Juan finally looked down at the girl. She'd stopped shaking, stopped breathing almost, her eyes fixed on the man in the doorway with a terror so pure it was almost tangible. This wasn't the fear of arrest. This was the fear of prey recognizing a predator. Emma, Juan said softly, surprising himself with the gentleness. Look at me. She did. Those eyes, blue-green and swimming with tears, met his. Is he a police officer? She shook her head, the movement barely perceptible. What is he? Her voice came out broken, raw. A monster wearing a costume. Juan's expression didn't change, but something shifted in the room's atmosphere. He looked back at the officer, and this time when he smiled, it was the smile that had made lesser men disappear into the river. Get out of my sanctuary. The officer didn't leave. He stood in the doorway for another 30 seconds, his hand still hovering near his weapon, his face twisted with the kind of rage that came from plans falling apart. Then he backed out slowly, maintaining eye contact with Juan until the heavy doors swung shut between them. Victor moved to lock them. Chen stayed by the pool table, gun still drawn. Juan turned his attention to the girl still kneeling beside his booth. She was shaking again now that the immediate threat had passed, the adrenaline draining out of her and leaving nothing but exhaustion behind. Get up, Juan said, not unkindly. Sit. Emma pulled herself into the booth across from him, the leather squeaking under her wet clothes. Up close, he could see the bruise forming on her left wrist, the scrape across her knuckles where she'd probably fought back. Her backpack hit the table with a thud, and she wrapped both arms around it like it might disappear. Juan poured 2 fingers of bourbon into a clean glass and slid it across to her. She stared at it for a moment, then drank it in one burning gulp. Talk, Juan said. Emma's voice came out hoarse. I was driving home from campus. Night class. Marketing midterm. She laughed, a broken sound. I was thinking about whether I bombed question 5 when the lights came on behind me. Juan waited. He was good at waiting. He said my taillight was out. Asked for my license and registration. Her hands were trembling as she spoke, fingers picking at a loose thread on her backpack. I gave them to him. He went back to his car, and I thought it was just a ticket. But he took too long. 5 minutes. 7. I started getting nervous. So you looked, Juan said. She nodded. I turned around to see what was taking so long, and that's when I saw inside his patrol car. The back seat. Her breath hitched. There were zip ties. Industrial ones, the kind you can't break. Duct tape. A roll of plastic sheeting. And. She stopped, her face going white. And? Juan prompted. A duffel bag, she whispered. Unzipped. I could see women's shoes inside. Different sizes. Different styles. Like he'd collected them. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Victor made a sound low in his throat. Even Chen, who'd seen horrors that would make seasoned detectives vomit, looked disturbed. I panicked, Emma continued. I threw the car in drive and floored it. Ran 2 red lights. He chased me for 6 blocks with his sirens on, but I knew if I stopped, I was dead. Or worse. She looked up at Juan, and those eyes were full of the kind of knowledge that aged people overnight. I saw a parking spot near here and just ran. I didn't know where I was going. Then I saw your door and I just. You ran to a monster to escape a monster, Juan finished quietly. Emma met his gaze without flinching. At least you don't pretend to be something you're not. Juan dismissed Emma to one of the private rooms upstairs with Chen as her shadow. She'd be safe there, behind reinforced doors and men who knew how to make problems disappear. Victor stayed in the lounge, already on his phone making calls that would ripple through the city's underworld like shockwaves. But Juan sat alone with his ledger and a growing suspicion that made his carefully controlled world feel suddenly unstable. He opened his laptop and pulled up the financial records he kept separate from the physical books. The legitimate side of his empire, the restaurants, the construction companies, the real estate holdings that let him wash money so clean it could pass an IRS audit. These were the businesses that kept him insulated, respectable, untouchable. He started with the usual suspects. The holding companies that his lawyers had set up. The shell corporations that his accountant promised were airtight. He traced the money backward, following threads that most people didn't even know existed. That's when he found it. Northwest Transportation Solutions. A logistics company he'd invested in 3 years ago through a business partner named Marcus Delvin, a city councilman with political ambitions and a convincing pitch about supply chain optimization. Juan had put in $2 million without asking too many questions. The returns had been steady, unremarkable, exactly the kind of boring legitimate income that kept the feds from looking too closely at his other ventures. He dug deeper. Northwest Transportation Solutions had subsidiary contracts with the city police department. Vehicle maintenance. Equipment transport. And, Juan's jaw tightened, uniform supply and badge manufacturing. The pieces clicked together with sickening clarity. Marcus Delvin sat on the police oversight committee. He had access to personnel records, shift schedules, patrol routes. He'd know exactly which officers were dirty enough to look the other way and which were clean enough to avoid. And with a uniform supply contract, creating convincing fake badges and patrol car equipment would be trivially easy. Juan pulled up his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found Marcus's number. His thumb hovered over the call button, then moved past it. Calling would be a warning. Calling would give the man time to run or, worse, to start destroying evidence. Instead, Juan texted Victor a single name and 4 words, find everything. Stay quiet. He closed the laptop and returned to his physical ledger, flipping back 3 months to a notation he'd barely registered at the time. A request from Marcus to use one of Juan's warehouses in the industrial district for temporary storage. Juan had approved it without question. The warehouse was legitimate, properly zoned, nothing that would draw attention. Now he wondered what was being stored there. What kind of temporary inventory required a soundproof building in a neighborhood where people knew not to ask questions? He picked up his phone again and sent a second text, this time to a man named Sergey who specialized in reconnaissance. Port District Warehouse 7. Eyes only. Report what you see but do not engage. The response came back in seconds, copy. Juan poured himself another bourbon and stared at the closed ledger. 15 years he'd ruled this city by being smarter, more ruthless, and more careful than everyone else. 15 years of building an empire on the principle that he controlled every variable, every risk, every threat. And somehow, under his own roof, using his own money, someone had built a hunting ground. That ended tonight. Juan Freeman didn't do public appearances. For 15 years, he'd been a ghost, a name whispered in back rooms, a signature on documents that never bore his real one, a shadow that moved through the city unseen. That was how you survived at the top of the underworld. You stayed invisible. Until you needed to send a message that couldn't be misunderstood. The venue was the Whitmore Hotel, one of the city's oldest establishments, where the mayor held fundraisers and the police commissioner ate lunch every Thursday. Juan owned it through 3 separate shell corporations, but nobody was supposed to know that. Tonight, he wanted everyone to know. Emma stood beside him in the back seat of the black Mercedes, wearing clothes that Chen had procured from somewhere, dark jeans, a burgundy blouse, a leather jacket that actually fit. She looked terrified but determined, her hands clenched in her lap. You don't have to do this, Juan said quietly as Victor pulled up to the main entrance. Yes, I do, Emma replied. If I hide, I'm already gone. You said this makes me visible. Makes me real. It makes you mine, Juan corrected. In this city, that means something. But it also means you can't walk away from it. She turned to look at him, and those blue-green eyes held something he hadn't seen in them before, resolve. I stopped having normal options the second I saw what was in that back seat. The car doors opened. Juan stepped out first, and the effect was immediate. The valets froze. A couple entering the hotel stopped mid-step, the woman's hand flying to her mouth. A police cruiser that had been idling across the street suddenly pulled away, the officers inside clearly radioing for guidance they wouldn't receive. Then Juan extended his hand back toward the car, and Emma took it. The city collectively held its breath. They walked through the hotel's gilded entrance together, the notorious crime lord and the young woman who'd sought his protection. Juan didn't rush. He moved with the casual confidence of a man who owned everything he touched, and Emma stayed at his side, visible, undeniable, claimed. The lobby erupted in whispers. Phones came out. Photos were taken that would be on every news site and blog within the hour. Juan Freeman, the man who didn't exist in official records, was making himself a headline. They walked to the hotel restaurant, where the maitre d' looked like he might faint. Juan had reserved the corner table, the one with clear sightlines and no blind spots. He pulled out Emma's chair himself, a gesture of respect that wouldn't be missed by anyone watching. Mr. Freeman, the maitre d' managed, his voice strangled. We weren't expecting. I know, Juan said simply. Bring the wine list and tell your manager to inform the police commissioner that if anyone interrupts my dinner, I'll consider it a declaration of war. The maitre d' fled. Emma exhaled slowly. This is insane. This is survival, Juan corrected. He looked around the restaurant at the faces turned their way, politicians, lawyers, businessmen who operated in the gray spaces between legal and criminal. By tomorrow morning, every person in this city who matters will know your face and know that touching you means answering to me. And the ones who don't care about answering to you. Juan's smile was cold. Then they'll learn why they should have. The dinner had been theatrical, necessary, but exhausting. By the time they returned to the lounge, Emma looked like she might collapse from the weight of all those staring eyes. Juan sent her upstairs to rest, but she lingered at the base of the staircase, her hand on the polished rail. "Why?" she asked simply. Juan paused in the act of pouring himself a drink. "Why what? Why did you help me? You could have thrown me out. Could have let him take me. It would have been easier." She turned to face him fully. "Men like you don't do things without a reason." He should have deflected. Should have given her the practiced answer about territorial disputes and maintaining control. Instead, he found himself gesturing to the booth across from him. Emma sat. Juan took a long drink before speaking, his eyes focused on something distant and unreachable. "I had a sister once. Sophia. She was younger than me by 3 years. Smart. Wanted to be a teacher." Emma said nothing, sensing that interruption would shatter whatever fragile truth was emerging. "I was 17 when I joined my first crew. Thought I was untouchable. Thought the reputation would protect everyone around me." His jaw tightened. "I was wrong." The silence stretched between them, heavy with things that couldn't be unsaid once spoken. A rival crew wanted to send a message. They couldn't get to me, I was already too careful, too paranoid. So they got to her instead. Juan's fingers tightened around his glass. She was walking home from the library. It was 7:30 on a Tuesday evening. Still light out. She should have been safe. Emma's breath caught. What happened? They took her. 3 men in a van. Juan's voice had gone flat, emotionless, the only way he could tell this story without breaking. "By the time we found her, 2 days later, he stopped. Started again. She was gone. They'd left her in an abandoned warehouse like she was trash." "I'm sorry," Emma whispered. Juan shook his head. "Sorry doesn't change anything. Sorry doesn't bring her back. I hunted down every man involved. It took me 6 months, but I found them all. And I made sure they understood exactly what they'd taken from me before they died." He looked at Emma then, really looked at her. "When you ran through that door, when I saw the terror in your eyes, I saw Sophia. I saw the fear she must have felt when those men grabbed her. And I realized I'd spent 15 years becoming powerful enough to protect everyone except the one person who mattered. So I'm, what? A second chance?" Emma asked, but there was no accusation in her voice, only understanding. "No," Juan said quietly. "You're proof that power is worthless if you don't use it when it matters. I couldn't save Sophia. But I can save you." Emma reached across the table and placed her hand over his. "Then we save each other." Juan didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he let someone see the human underneath the monster. "Deal," he said. The war began at 3 in the morning, fought not with bullets but with information that moved through the city like poison in the bloodstream. Juan sat in his office surrounded by 3 laptops, 2 burner phones, and a stack of files that Sergei had delivered an hour earlier. Victor stood by the window, watching the street below. Chen was coordinating with their contacts across the city, hackers, private investigators, a forensic accountant who owed Juan a favor that could never be repaid. The files painted a picture uglier than Juan had anticipated. The fake officer who'd chased Emma was named Derek Moss, but he wasn't working alone. Sergei's surveillance of Warehouse 7 had uncovered a network of 6 men, all with legitimate police credentials, all moonlighting as predators. They'd been operating for at least 2 years, using traffic stops and welfare checks as hunting grounds. The duffel bag Emma had seen wasn't the only one. There were 17 more in that warehouse, each containing personal effects from women who'd simply vanished from the city's streets. Marcus Delvin's name appeared throughout the operation, not as a participant but as an enabler, providing cover, routing money through Northwest Transportation Solutions, making sure investigations stalled before they gained traction. "Where do we start?" Victor asked. Juan smiled, and it was the smile that made people disappear. "We start by making them visible. The first domino fell at 6 in the morning when the FBI received an anonymous tip about financial irregularities at Northwest Transportation Solutions. The tip included detailed records of payments that didn't match invoices, contracts that existed only on paper, and a fascinating pattern of money flowing to offshore accounts in the Caymans. Juan had made sure the documentation was impeccable, enough to trigger an audit, not enough to lead back to him. The second domino fell an hour later when 3 major newspapers received identical packages. Inside each was a flash drive containing footage from Warehouse 7's security cameras, footage that Sergey had quietly obtained before planting it where it would be found. The videos showed Derek Moss and his crew sorting through personal belongings, laughing as they catalogued their trophies. The timestamps were damning. These men had been hunting while on duty, using city resources to cover their crimes. By 9 in the morning, the story was breaking across every news channel. Police corruption scandal rocks city. Missing women linked to rogue officers. The police commissioner held an emergency press conference, his face ashen, promising a full investigation. Juan watched it all from his office, making calls that seemed unrelated but weren't. A judge who owed him received information about Derek Moss's sealed juvenile record, assault charges that had been buried when he applied to the academy. A city councilwoman known for her advocacy work got documentation proving that Marcus Delvin had blocked funding for a database that would have tracked missing persons more effectively. A reporter with a Pulitzer and a reputation for destroying corrupt officials received a detailed timeline showing how many women had vanished since Northwest Transportation Solutions won its city contract. The dismantling accelerated. Derek Moss was pulled over at 10:15 for a traffic violation he didn't commit. When the officers searched his car, with a warrant that had been expedited through channels Juan controlled, they found 2 phones, one personal and one burner. The burner contained text messages coordinating pickups with the other members of the crew. By noon, all 6 men were in custody. Marcus Delvin tried to run. He made it as far as the airport before federal agents stopped him. The charges were financial, wire fraud, embezzlement, money laundering. The human trafficking connections would come later, once prosecutors built their case. But Juan had made sure Delvin's bank accounts were frozen, his properties seized, his reputation destroyed before he even reached booking. By late afternoon, Juan's network had fed information to 12 different law enforcement agencies, each receiving precisely what they needed to feel like they'd uncovered the conspiracy themselves. The FBI was investigating the financial crimes. State police were examining the trafficking operation. Internal Affairs was tearing apart the department looking for other officers who might have known and looked away. Emma came down to the office around 6, drawn by the sound of phones ringing constantly. She stood in the doorway, watching Juan orchestrate the destruction of men who'd thought themselves untouchable. "Is it over?" she asked. Juan looked up from his laptop. "Not yet. They're arrested, but arrests aren't convictions. I've made sure the evidence is airtight, but trials take time. What happens if they get out on bail?" "They won't." Juan's voice carried absolute certainty. "I've ensured that every judge in this city understands the political cost of showing leniency. And if somehow one of them does walk..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Emma crossed the room and looked at the laptop screen showing news coverage of the arrests. "You destroyed them without firing a single shot." "I told you," Juan said quietly. "Power is worthless if you don't use it when it matters. These men built their hunting ground in the shadows. I just turned on the lights." Victor's phone buzzed. He checked it and looked at Juan. "The last one just confessed. Gave up 17 victims, 12 of whom are still alive. They're being recovered now. 12 still alive. 12 women who'd get to go home because Emma had run through the right door." Juan closed his laptop. "Now it's over." They came at 2 in the morning, when they thought the city would be sleeping and Juan would be vulnerable. They were wrong on both counts. Derek Moss had been released on a technicality, a warrant signed by a judge who'd mysteriously disappeared from his office before Juan could reach him, a judge whose bank accounts would later reveal deposits from offshore accounts tied to the trafficking ring. It was sloppy, desperate, the kind of move that came from an organization collapsing in on itself. But desperate men were the most dangerous kind. Moss brought 4 others with him, not cops this time but hired muscle, the kind of ex-military contractors who asked no questions if the price was right. They approached the lounge from 3 directions, armed with automatic weapons and flashbangs, planning to breach fast and extract Emma before Juan could respond. They made it as far as the outer perimeter before Juan's world reminded them who really controlled the city. The first man went down silently, Chen's blade finding the gap between his body armor and helmet before he could radio a warning. The second triggered a pressure sensor that Victor had installed 6 hours earlier, flooding the alley with LED spotlights so bright they whited out the night vision goggles. He stumbled backward, blind, and found himself staring at 3 red laser dots centered on his chest. Inside the lounge, Juan sat in his usual booth with Emma beside him. She'd insisted on staying, refused to hide in the safe room upstairs. "If they come for me, I face them," she'd said. "I'm done running." So Juan had let her stay, but he'd also called in every favor, every debt, every man who understood that an attack on Juan Freeman's sanctuary was an attack on the established order of the city itself. The lounge wasn't empty tonight. 20 men occupied the shadows, professionals who'd worked with Juan for years, who knew his methods and trusted his instincts. This wasn't just about protecting Emma anymore. This was about sending a message that would echo through the underworld for years: you don't touch what's his. The door exploded inward right on schedule, flashbangs tumbling through the opening in a sequence that should have blinded and deafened everyone inside. But Juan had evacuated the main room an hour ago, moved everyone to defensive positions behind reinforced barriers. The grenades detonated in empty space, their fury wasted on furniture and air. Derek Moss came through the smoke, rifle raised, moving with tactical precision toward the booth where Emma should have been cowering. Instead, he found himself in a kill box, surrounded by men who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. "Stop," Juan's voice cut through the ringing silence that followed the explosions. He stood at the top of the stairs, Emma behind him but visible, protected but not hidden. "Drop the weapon." Moss spun, rifle tracking toward Juan's voice, but he was already too late. Red dots painted his chest, his head, his hands. 20 men with 20 different angles, each one a guaranteed kill shot. "You made a mistake," Moss snarled, desperation cracking his voice. "You think you can protect her? You think you're untouchable? I'll burn this whole city down before I let you." "You'll do nothing," Juan interrupted, descending the stairs with the calm of a man who'd already won. "Your crew is in custody. Your operation is destroyed. The FBI has enough evidence to put you away for 3 lifetimes. You came here tonight because you have nowhere else to go, nothing left to lose." He stopped 3 feet from Moss, close enough to see the wild panic in the man's eyes. "But I'm going to give you something you didn't give those 17 women. I'm going to give you a choice." Moss's finger twitched on the trigger. "Drop the weapon and walk out of here alive to face trial," Juan continued, his voice dropping to that lethal whisper that made grown men reconsider their mortality. "Or pull that trigger and prove to everyone watching that you're exactly the monster we say you are, and I'll make sure there's not enough left of you to bury." The standoff lasted 5 seconds that felt like 5 hours. Then Moss's rifle clattered to the floor. Juan nodded to Victor, who moved in with zip ties, the same industrial kind Moss had kept in his patrol car. The poetry of it wasn't lost on anyone in the room. "Take him to the police," Juan said. "Make sure the cameras catch every second of his surrender. I want the city to see what happens when predators hunt in my territory." As Victor hauled Moss toward the door, Emma stepped out from behind Juan. She looked at the man who'd tried to take her, the man who'd terrorized her and countless others, and her voice was steady when she spoke. "You lose." Moss said nothing. There was nothing left to say. Juan watched them leave, then turned to survey the damage to his sanctuary. The door would need replacing. The furniture was destroyed. But the message had been sent, received, and understood. Emma stood beside him, and this time when she took his hand, it wasn't from fear. It was from trust. 3 weeks after Derek Moss was dragged from the lounge in zip ties, the city settled into a new reality that nobody quite knew how to name. The trials were moving forward with unusual efficiency. All 6 officers had pleaded guilty in exchange for avoiding the death penalty, their confessions filling thousands of pages of court documents that would be studied by law enforcement agencies across the country. Marcus Delvin was fighting his charges, but the evidence was overwhelming: financial records, witness testimony, and a paper trail that led directly to his office. His political career was ashes. His business empire was being dismantled piece by federal regulators who'd suddenly found the resources to care. The 12 women who'd been recovered alive were being reunited with families who'd thought them dead. Their stories filled the news cycles, tales of survival that were both horrifying and hopeful. Emma had met with 3 of them, quiet conversations in coffee shops and therapy offices, women who understood what she'd been through because they'd lived worse. Juan's lounge had been rebuilt, the new door even heavier than the last, but something fundamental had changed. He still sat in his corner booth with his ledger and his bourbon, still controlled the city's underworld with the same iron grip, but now when people spoke his name, they did so with a different kind of respect. The police commissioner had requested a meeting, an unprecedented move that violated every unwritten rule about how the legitimate world and the criminal world interacted. Juan had agreed, and they'd sat across from each other in this very booth while the commissioner asked if Juan would be willing to share information about human trafficking operations that might be using the city as a waypoint. "I'm not asking you to become an informant," the commissioner had said carefully. "I'm asking if we can agree that some crimes offend us both." Juan had considered this for a long moment before nodding once. The arrangement was never formalized, never put on paper, but information began to flow in both directions: anonymous tips that led to arrests, warnings about investigations that might accidentally sweep up legitimate operations. The city's power structure had shifted, and everyone was still learning how to navigate it. Emma came down the stairs carrying 2 cups of coffee, one black for Juan, one with cream and sugar for herself. She'd moved into one of the apartments Juan owned, a secure building with guards who reported directly to Victor. She'd gone back to school, finishing her marketing degree with a focus that surprised her professors. When they asked what she wanted to do with her education, she told them she wanted to work with nonprofits that helped trafficking survivors. Nobody asked why. They could see it in her eyes. She sat across from Juan now, in what had become her usual spot, and opened her laptop. She was helping him track financial patterns that might indicate other trafficking operations, her marketing background giving her insights into how these networks advertised and recruited. She'd become an asset, not just someone he protected but someone who helped him protect others. "There's chatter about a new group operating out of the Port District," Emma said without preamble. "Different MO, but the pattern is familiar." Juan closed his ledger and gave her his full attention. "Tell me." As she spoke, laying out her analysis with the precision of someone who'd learned to see the world in terms of predators and prey, Juan realized that something unexpected had happened over these past 3 weeks. He'd started this as an act of protection, a way to redeem a failure from his past. But Emma hadn't stayed a victim. She'd transformed herself into something harder, sharper, someone who understood that survival wasn't passive. She'd become part of his world, not as an outsider seeking sanctuary, but as an equal who'd earned her place. When she finished her briefing, Juan made 3 phone calls, setting in motion an investigation that would take weeks to complete. Emma watched him work, learning the rhythms of his operation, understanding how power flowed through the city's hidden channels. "You know, this changes nothing about what I am," Juan said after the last call ended. "I'm still a criminal. Still a monster by most definitions." Emma met his gaze without flinching. "And I'm still the girl who ran to a monster for protection. But maybe monsters aren't defined by what they are. Maybe they're defined by what they choose to protect." Juan raised his glass in a silent toast. Emma raised hers to match. Outside, the city continued its restless movement, unaware that in a private lounge behind a reinforced door, a new order had been established. Juan Freeman was no longer just the ghost who ruled from shadows. He'd become something the city hadn't had in decades, a guardian who operated outside the law but answered to something deeper than legal authority. He answered to the debt he owed to a sister he couldn't save and to every person who ran through his door seeking sanctuary from monsters wearing masks. The ledger sat closed on the table. Some debts could never be repaid. But some could be honored through action, through choice, through the deliberate decision to use darkness in service of light. Juan Freeman had made his choice. And the city would never be the same. Thanks for watching. Please like, comment and subscribe.